Lesson 5, federalism. So we have looked at the principle of the separation of powers and how this leads to a strong system of checks and balances and therefore limited government. And limited government is a good thing for democracy because we don't want anybody to become all powerful. We've also looked at the protection of rights in the Constitution through the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, and then subsequent amendments. And now we need to have a look at federalism. This is quite a big topic, and sometimes people get a little bit confused about the word federalism because we use the word federal government. So I just want to make sure that before we crack on with this, that you know what the difference is. So when we're talking about federal government, we mean those people in Washington, so the president and Congress. So anytime we say federal, that's what we mean. Federalism is about how power is divided between that federal government and the states. So, federalism in the US Constitution, as you know from your reading and pre-shoot videos, it isn't actually explicitly mentioned anywhere in the Constitution. It is implied. And this divide in powers is implied through two ways. One, we know that there are powers explicitly given to Congress in Article 1, Section 8, so things like the power to declare war, the power to collect taxes. And then secondly, there is the 10th Amendment, which tells us that any power that has not been mentioned or given to Congress or the President is a power that can be given to states. So make sure that in any kind of essay where we're talking about the relationship between the federal government and the states and how it might be changing, we actually say right at the beginning of an essay, there is no proper definition of federalism in the Constitution, and therefore it's sometimes open to interpretation. And today in this lesson we're going to have a look at how the relationship between the states and federal government has changed over time, and how sometimes the states take back control and then other times the federal government takes back control. All of the information we're going to go through today is quite historical. You will probably mostly refer to the information that I'm going to give you on Obama and Bush, but there are elements that we will be able to use in future essays, but I don't want you to get too bogged down in the historical issues. So I'm going to run through it really quickly, or as quickly as I can. Now this is something that I would have done on the board. So I've had to scan in documents and it looks like this, so hopefully you should all have one of these. I'm going to talk you through this document, and basically I'm telling you what's happened in America, and if I draw an arrow this way, it means that I'm telling you that the states have taken back a little bit more power, and on this one I'm telling you that federal government is taking back more power. This will be useful when we try to write an essay weighing up whether federal government has become too big or whether states are able to defend the rights of their state citizens. It might also be useful when we look at whether the Constitution actually does a good job, because this relationship's ever changing, it kind of tells us that maybe the Constitution isn't really working that well, because nothing stays the same. It keeps going federal government, state, federal government, state. But anyway, that's for future lessons, that's for future excitement when we come to those essays, and I'll take you through those. But for now, can you please get your handouts and we will start working through these. Pause me at any time. Try not to pause me when I'm going, Anyway, let's get on. So, when the Constitution was written, the idea was that we had this thing called dual federalism. So we're starting at the top, dual federalism. And this was the idea that the states had their powers and Congress and the President had their powers, and they both knew exactly what to do, what their powers were. They didn't mix with each other. They did their thing, they did their thing. Nobody challenged anybody on those powers. And often it's called layer cake federalism, because if you think of a Victoria sponge, you can clearly see Victoria sponge, and then the cream of jam, and the Victoria Sponge. So it's all very, very clear. We can identify whose powers are whose. And through the 10th Amendment, this made it nice and clear, and through Article 1, they're your enumerated powers. But early on, in the 1800s, we saw states going, look, we've given you these enumerated powers, but we're going to nullify any laws that we disagree with. So we're on the first bit of the handout here. We're going to nullify any laws that we don't agree with. Nullify, we're not going to agree with them. We're going to ignore them. So here, I've drawn an arrow to the states. You can see states really sort of defending themselves, being quite independent and saying to federal government, you can't really tell us what to do, we're equal. And anything that you do that clashes with what we believe, we're just going to ignore it. But then we come to this case called Abelman versus Booth. Now, this was quite a landmark court case where the Supreme Court said that states, they can't overturn federal courts. So remember, federal, we're talking about in Washington. They can't overturn anything there. So any state court decision, if it clashes with a federal court, the states have to do what the federal courts tell them. So this was, and the first time we sort of saw federal government taking power. So that's why I've drawn an arrow that way. But the states fought back. So we got to this case called Dred Scott, and those who do history might have talked about Dred Scott before. It's quite a famous case. So 1857, this slave, Dred Scott, he lived in Illinois, and he tried to take his case to the court to make him free. He wanted to sue the state for his freedom. So Illinois had said that slavery was abolished, yet he was still classed as a slave. He wasn't classed as an American citizen, and he wanted his freedom. But in a 7-2 decision, so that means 7 judges against 2, the judges, the Supreme Court said, no, we're not going to count anyone of African ancestry as an American citizen. So they said, yeah, the state's quite right. The state doesn't have to give you your freedom. And even though federal government really disagreed with that, federal government wanted to give all African Americans citizenship, the states were allowed to say, nope, you're not going to be given your freedom. So there we see states taking back their powers, and that is through a court case. But carrying on down, we get to the 13th and 14th Amendments. So Congress not very happy that the states, some states, lots of states, still have slavery. They want people to be protected. They want all citizens to become full American citizens and be protected under the law. So they created the 13th and 14th Amendments. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, and the 14th Amendment was created to give everybody equal protection under the law by saying that anybody born in America became an American citizen, or anybody naturalised in America could become an American citizen. And naturalised means that you came from a different country, but you have chosen to make America your chosen citizenship, chosen country where you want to be a citizen, basically. So that was quite clever. That was federal government going to the states, right, okay, so you're going to ignore us, and the Supreme Court says that you're allowed to have slaves and you don't have to. So what we're going to do is we're going to amend the Constitution. And remember that Article 6 says that anything in the Constitution is supreme to all other laws. So the states had to allow African slaves to become American citizens. So here we see federal government really, really taking back power. So that really made a lot of states cross, because remember, lots of states still wanted, they didn't want to give full citizenship to lots of people who had been slaves or still were slaves. So that's a really helpful one actually to refer to as well. When we talk about how the Constitution can be updated and can be used to amend things and keep up with the times, because people wanted to see an end to slavery, so Congress ended slavery with the 13th and 14th Amendments. Okay, so that's in the 1800s.